Good morning, everybody. We're just letting everybody into the meeting room. And we're just going to wait a couple of minutes to make sure we've got everyone on. If I could ask you to make sure that you mute yourself and if you are talking, that would be great. And yes, we are in Teams today, which I'm sure you all know how to use, but there is a sort of chat function, so feel free to use that chat function to talk amongst yourselves, to say hi, put up interesting links, thoughts, and the rest of it. We are also having using a Q&A function a bit later on in the session if you want to sort of ask a question to any of the Northern Powergrid team. So that's we'll be asking you to ask those directly. So if you could make sure your name is up on your screen so we can ask you to unmute and to ask a question directly. So we've got most people in already, so I'm just gonna start and Emma will carry on letting people in. So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. Just to introduce myself, I'm Poppy Maltby from Regen. I'm going to be chairing this Northern Powergrid training session today on connecting community projects. So we've got a number of sort of experts from Northern Powergrid who are here to sort of help you demystify and understand a little bit more about the connections process. Hopefully help you some problem solving, recognize some of the challenges, and just essentially know a little bit more about how to do it and what to do. So I think before we kick off with agendas or slides or anything, I'm just going to ask the members of the Northern Powergrid team just to say hello, so they so you know who they are, and just a quick overview of what they do. So I'm going to start with Helen, I think.
Thanks, Poppy. Good morning, everybody. I'm Helen Precy. I'm Stakeholder Engagement Manager at Northern Powergrid. So my job is to make sure we listen to our stakeholders, people like yourselves, and that we run helpful and useful events, forums, collaborations to share knowledge, to get to know what you need, and to respond to that as effectively as possible. So I'll be popping up today, but it's important to say that I'm here to make sure the event runs well. So if you've got any feedback about how we can do this and how this meets your needs, I'm all ears. So I'll speak to you shortly. Thank you, Poppy.
Thanks, Ian.
Morning. I think looking at the assembled masses out there, I recognise many of the names, and many people will know me in one of my previous guises anyway. But today I'm the head of connections design, and I'm looking after the overall running of the design of connections from a technical point of view, particularly. Although some of my guys are very much involved in the process as well.
Thanks, Ian. And we have Matthew.
Yeah, good morning, folks. Matthew Brown here, Northern Powergrid. So I'm a design engineer, so at the coalface, designing new connections, all from small houses up to large factories.
Lovely. Cameron.
Morning, everyone. My name's Cameron Moody. I work in the contact centre, so we deal with the inbound calls on connections-related enquiries. So any questions that from a connections point of view, we would hopefully be able to answer at the first point of asking, but if not, then we always have someone to refer to and come back to if that's the case.
And we have Lizzie.
Morning. So I work in the new DSO business as a local system planning engineer. We work largely with local authorities and slightly larger organisations on strategic planning, but clearly there'll be some overlap between community energy projects, potentially getting some support from their councils that tie in with the council's plans for net zero.
Lovely. And Connor, I think, is here.
Good morning, all. I do a very similar job to Lizzie, so I'm a local system planning engineer in the new DSO business unit. So sort of expanding on what Lizzie's saying, we sort of provide sort of more a data-driven approach to sort of strategic planning in regards to sort of the LEAP, detailed in sort of the energy systems catapult.
Lovely. Thanks, everybody. So George from Regen might want to say hi as well. And he's going to put some slides up. Lovely. Thanks, George. You're also on mute.
Hi, everyone. George here from Regen. So I work in the community energy team at Regen with my colleague Prina and Poppy. And yeah, we do a lot of work around supporting community energy organisations and working with Northern Powergrid to do that. And it's a delight to be able to put this session on for you guys today. I know the connections process is something we've heard a lot about, that it's something you want to learn more about. So yeah, really excited about today, and I hope you will get what you want from it. And I'll see you in the breakout groups.
Lovely. Thank you. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll just quickly run you through the agenda, but essentially it's a session of 2 parts. We're going to be relatively high level at the beginning, make sure everyone knows what we're talking about in introductions to the connections session with Helen and Ian. We're then going to have a breakout group to understand a little bit more about what you're trying to do and the sort of experiences you've had so far. We're then going to have a bit of a group Q&A discussion before a tea break at 11:05. In the second session, we're going to go into a bit more detail. We're going to be talking about some of the tools, some of the application forms, some of the timescales and processes. So some of the more detailed stuff about trying to get your projects connected. And we're going to hear from Cameron, Matthew, Helen and Ian in that process. We'll then have a second breakout group where we can interrogate further some of the issues that they've raised in there, have a group Q&A, and then end with a quick question to find out how today has gone. So that's our agenda. I think I mentioned housekeeping to most people already, but we have a Q&A function and a chat function on Teams. So if you would like to just chat amongst yourselves, please use the chat for questions that you would like to ask to Northern Powergrid in these sort of plenary sessions that we've got after the breakout groups. Then that is the Q&A session, Q&A section. But we are anticipating that mainly those can be asked in the breakout groups, which will be slightly more sort of informal discussion areas. So I think we're just gonna do now a quick Mentimeter. I hope there's not a collective groan. We find them quite useful to understand before we kick off how well people think they know the connections process for their projects. So if you could go please on another screen or on a smartphone to menti.com and add in a code when prompted of 7176 8360. We just want to get a sense of how well you understand the connection process at the moment. So the Northern Powergrid team can make sure they're pitching this at the right level for you. And it should magically come up on the screen.
It seems that the results aren't displaying.
Results aren't displaying.
So they might be they're in the background, but yeah, we can. I'll look into it and we can feedback.
Okay, thanks. But yes, if you could give us a sense of where you think you are at the moment on how well you understand the connections process. We're hoping to run this again at the end of the session to check if you've moved along at all, which we very much hope we have. I've got a hand from Katie.
Hi,
Hi.
It might just be me being dim, but I don't have a question. I don't have any options to click on. It just says, how well do you understand the connections process, and then submit. So you might not get any results because there's nothing to answer.
Okay.
Yeah, agree to.
George, we're going to take that away and we will try and run this later, but we now have some slides to kick us off. So we will move into the presentation and I'm going to hand over to Helen.
Yeah, sure. Morning, everybody. Thank you for your patience with Menti. We'll come back to that because that's a bit mission critical to get a sense of where your starting point is. And so I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction to who Northern Powergrid is. So we've got some stalwart stakeholders on our session this morning who've probably heard this many times, but just for clarity, I'm just going to frame, and I'm going to talk about today's objectives. Do you want to move on to the next slide, please, George? So this is a really tricky session to run because I know that lots of you have got in-depth understanding about connecting and come from a very technical perspective, but there may be some people amongst you where actually you want to walk through right from the beginning in terms of what a connection is. So today we're going to attempt the feat of doing both. So we're going to start with really simply what is a connection, and some examples, and set the scene. And then we're going to move into discussions around that from your colleagues to gain some insight into who's actually connected and got experience of that. And then we're going to talk about the application. I can be sure that we will have questions today where we're going to need to park them and come back to you. And there may be some more complex questions around the network, having looked at some of you who've joined us today, where we actually need to come back, you know, either individually or as a group and say, actually, you know, this is more information to answer your questions. So if we get there, bear with us. No question is the wrong question. So please, you know, ask whatever you need to help to build your understanding of this area. And sometimes that might mean at the end of the day, you actually just need to have a chat with one of us subsequently, and that's absolutely fine, because this is a really complex piece, which we're going to endeavour to do in the morning. So just to manage your expectations. This is driven from, you know, we have lots of conversations with community energy colleagues like yourselves and ask continually, what would you like from us and what can we provide you to help you grow your community energy efforts? And this is a key area where you came back, you know, with some initial information and some more detailed information about connections, whether you've got a project for real or it's something in the future that you're bringing together parts of your community to build. This is almost a part of the sort of fundamental journey of today and onwards. Thanks, Poppy. And George, do you want to move on? So, okay, just to set the scene and manage expectations. As you know, we've got a very big geography as Northern Powergrid, right from, you know, where I am in Calderdale, right up to Morpeth and beyond Northumberland and North East Lincolnshire. Lots of different geographies, lots of typology and lots of different community groups working on community energy. And it's growing, as you know, because you're driving that change. So we're here to move energy, and I'm going to hand over to Ian to sort of explain that a little bit more. But as many of you know, we're not an energy supplier. We're here to distribute it across the region, and we do that overhead and underground. Our business is changing as well. Today, we've got members of our distribution system operator, our DSO unit, which is brand new, which Lizzie O'Connor are from. So the services that we offer and the way that we manage electricity is changing dramatically. And you're part of that. Conversations like today are part of that. So we're regulated, which means that we work in business cycles and we use loads of jargon. And Poppy will stop us today if we go into acronyms and complexity, and you need to also raise your hands at that point too, because we need to make sure we're really accessible. But April's an important month for us because we've started our new business plan, and lots of you contributed to that thinking over the last few years to build what the areas and the priorities that the business is investing in to aid decarbonisation across the region. So that's an exciting time, and it's full of challenge as we move towards, you know, together to help net zero. Thanks, Poppy.
Thanks,
George,
Ellen.
do you want to move on?
Yeah.
To the next slide. Thanks. So in a moment, so we've got this incredibly complex slide, which is there to try to tell the story of what we do. So I'm going to, at this point, hand over to Ian just to frame it, to give you a sense of where we are and where we're going to move to, just so you've got this context of Northern Powergrid and what we do. Thanks, Ian.
Morning. Right. Well, this is a bit of a coming back to something I used to do to some extent for me. I used to look after the connections business about 10 years ago, and I've been out of it, and I've been working in innovation for the last kind of 6 years, and came back into connections about 8 weeks ago. So for all those people who are finding it new, or it's something you're just touching on, welcome to the club. I'm back in it again. Some things have changed. The level of things that are going on have changed spectacularly, but the fundamentals behind it haven't. We don't make electricity. We don't generate it. We don't buy it. We don't sell it. We don't own it, with the exception of the electricity we use in our own premises to keep the lights on in our offices, the same as anybody else does. What we do is we shift it from people who make it to people who want to use it. And we let the people who buy it and sell it know how much through the metering function. That's not absolutely correct, but it's close enough. So they can build the right amounts. And then we charge the people who are buying and selling it a small amount of money for the use of our system, distribution use of system charges, if anyone is aware of the term DUOS. So what's changing? What's different from when I was looking at this 10 years ago? Well, there's far more generation these days. There's far more storage as well. Battery storage was not an issue 10 years ago. And that's become quite interesting. It's become quite interesting both on a kind of huge merchant scale, where we're seeing kind of 200 megawatt batteries, but also for individual homeowners and communities where they may be wishing to store the electricity that they create through solar or wind or something like that, to use it at a different time. And that might be very useful. I do it myself, actually, at my house. I have solar on the roof and a battery in the garage, and do that myself to basically make the best use of the electricity I'm generating. So moving forwards, where does community energy sit in all that? I think that it becomes absolutely fundamental to the electricity system. Certainly, if you were to roll the clock out 10, 20 years, I think it's going to be almost a standard way of doing electricity, that you're going to try and make it where you use it. It's going to be done behind the meter by private individuals. It's going to be done on a community scale. And I think there's very good reasons for that, not only to do with how do we roll out decarbonised generation on a wider scale, and it's far easier to roll out a lot of small things than one or two large things. Certainly in this country, I think in some other countries, planning issues might be a bit different, and the way that they do infrastructure is a bit different. But for us, we've always been very good at that, and we're not so good at the large kind of grand project thing. So that is where we find ourselves today. Just give me a second. Right. Sorry, coughing. So going forwards and rolling that forwards, I expect to see communities owning small generators, owning small amounts of storage, possibly having community charging facilities for cars. Wouldn't that be a sensible way of making use of it and making the best use of your own facilities and looking after that sort of thing? I would expect to see some of the heating of community buildings and things like that moving on to low carbon technologies. Perhaps heat pumps and the like in there, and those are all things that will need new connections or additional capacity in the existing connection, or new ways of using that connection addressing. I think if we roll on to the next slide. So let's talk about connections, and I'm going to try and keep it very simple, mainly for me. The rest of you may have a far better understanding of your own connections and bits and pieces on your network, and we can discuss that possibly in the breakout sessions, possibly in Q&As and things like that. But if you have a connection, if you have some premises and you want a connection, you can apply for one. You apply to us, and we'll work out what work needs doing. There will be a charge for the sole use assets, as we call them, the bit that goes from your premises to our existing system and is used by nobody else. That will pretty much always be chargeable at some level. We'll talk about the reinforcement that might or might not be required to make our existing system big enough and strong enough to look after you guys later on. But just that little bit, there's always going to be a charge associated with that. If you have a connection, you can ask for it to be modified in some ways or enlarged to cope with the bits and pieces you're putting on. And that might be as simple as a fuse change in a cutout. A cutout is the because I'm going to get pulled up on jargon in just a second, so I'll pull myself up. The cutout is the box that might sit on the outside of your house or might sit under your stairs where the meter is. Every premises has a cutout. When you get to industrial premises, they're rather bigger and beefier, and it might actually take the form of a large piece of equipment like a circuit breaker. But the fuse is in there to basically stop faults in the system, causing problems. Typically, a house would have a 60 or an 80 amp fuse in it. My house had a 60 amp fuse until very recently when I put the car charging in the battery, and I had that upgraded to an 80. So that was a modification to my supply. You can connect specific low carbon technologies to existing premises. Now, again, this is another thing you might need to talk to us either before or after. I'll come to that in a second. But the types of things we're talking about in terms of low carbon technologies, generation, and everyone thinks of solar panels on roofs, whether that's the local kind of community hall or a house or whatever. But it's also wind turbines. Particularly in rural communities, that might make sense. In some places, combined heat and power might make sense, but that's becoming less prevalent as we start to see people thinking about, well, how are we going to heat? Are we really going to heat with gas? If you're not going to heat with gas, then combined heat and power is probably less interesting. It still occasionally turns up. We'll see batteries where people store energy. That might be because they can get a cheap rate overnight and then use it during the day. That can be quite useful. You can drop your electricity costs by kind of 75% there. Admittedly, you have the cost of a battery to net off against that. With EV charging, obviously, and we've got heat pumps. Those are kind of new types of replacements for either petrol and diesel in one case, or for natural gas in the other mainly. Although some diesel oil in there as well. Those are just new demands that are there. The interesting one about EV charging, of course, is it's an unusual load, and the one time you're using the asset that you have, the car, is the one time you won't be charging it. So most load, I'm getting a lot of feedback now.
Yeah,
thanks. Most loads, and this is going to sound like a statement of the bleeding obvious when I say it, but most of the time, if you're running a dishwasher or something, then it takes load off the system at the time you run it. An EV, an electric vehicle, exactly the opposite. The one time it is actually in use is when it's not connected to the system. So that has some interesting characteristics in terms of how it can be connected and how it can move load around and things like that. So I mentioned that you might have to talk to us. So for some equipment, you can talk to us after you've connected it, and for typically solar, but small generation generally, but it's typically solar that we're talking about, and typically on people's roofs, you can have 16 amps per phase. That's 3.68 kilowatts, if you prefer it in kilowatts, without notifying us in advance as a single premises. Now, for most domestic houses, that means 3.68 kilowatts. If you're talking about a local hall or something like that, it might have what we call three-phase supply, which basically means you get 3 live wires coming in as opposed to 1. Then you get 16 amps on each of those phases. So that comes out as 11.04. And if anyone can measure the 0.4, well done, but 11.04 kilowatts that you're allowed on that connection without telling us. You can have more potentially, but you have to tell us in advance, and you have to let us do a design and work out whether or not it can actually be connected without upgrading the system. If you're connecting an EV, a charging point for an EV rather, you can have on a typical kind of domestic connection up to 60 amps, including the EV charger. Now, EV charger typically, a domestic one would be around about the 7 kilowatt region, around about 32 amps. And therefore you'd be looking at the rest for your house. But because, as I said, the EV is likely to be being charged at a time when at a time you're choosing, effectively, it's not when you're using it, that you can actually charge that overnight, say when there's not much use in the rest of the house, to take you up to that 60 amps. If we talk about larger capacities, then they'll need an application in advance, and you'll need to let us do a design study and say, yes, it's okay, no, it isn't. We need to make these changes to the system. There are these costs associated, and so on and so forth. And if you look on our website, you'll find some typical prices for different types of connection listed. Don't go and raise the funding based on those typical prices. They'll give you a kind of ballpark, but not all. Sometimes it's much lower, sometimes it's much higher, but it's a typical kind of one we'd expect rather than the one you're really going to necessarily see there and then. So that's a very quick and very high level. Poppy did say it was going to be very high level in the first half, and I think I've managed to keep it reasonably high level. I did mention amps and cutouts, so I think I might get told off for that at some point. And at that point, I'll hand back to Poppy, I think, who's going to take us forwards into breakout.
Thank you. And you actually also told me some things I didn't know about the sort of how much solar you can put on different premises without notifying. So that is that's great. That's really useful. I think what I was going to ask Matthew now was just to give a quick overview before we go into the breakout groups of the different sort of types of cost that you would get on a bill. Now, Ian sort of mentioned sole use asset, but I was going to let Matthew give the sort of 101 on the different types of costs that you're going to be or potentially seeing. So I'm going to hand quickly over to you.
Sure, yeah. So we're going to touch on this a bit later, but typically there's 3 sets of costs that we'll give you with a connection offer. The first is the connection offer expense, and that's the cost that we charge to produce a quotation and carry out the design and see whether we can plug a particular bit of kit into the network. And then there's 2 other costs of the actual costs to carry out the job. Now, we do encourage competition and connections at Northern Powergrid. So there's the job split into 2 elements. The first is the works that only Northern Powergrid can carry out. So that might be replacing a transformer or increasing the size of a cable in order so we can connect your load on. And then there's the works that you can get what's called an independent connection provider to carry out. So that might be the last bit of cable from our network to your property, the trenching, and so on and so forth. So we produce a quote that's split into 2 parts. The first option is for Northern Powergrid to do all the works, so the contestable and the non-contestable parts. And then the second part of the quote is a non-contestable only, so that's the items on the job that only we can carry out, and then you can take that to an independent connection provider to get a quotation from themselves to carry out the contestable elements.
Yeah. Just on that, Matthew, it's probably worth you'll have a better feel at the kind of lower voltages. I'll have a better feel at the higher voltages. But what kind of percentage is typically the contestable works on a quote? It's normally fairly high.
Yeah, it's for a low voltage connection where we don't have to do any reinforcement. It can be as high for the contestable element as high as 90-95% of the cost of the job.
Yeah, and that's in the competitive marketplace, and you can get the best price that you can find from an independent connections provider.
Exactly. Yeah, it is important to say it does have to be an independent connection provider registered with the Lloyd's register. You can't just approach an electrician, say, to carry out the works. But yeah, there's plenty of ICPs out there.
So I've always seen it as that you could get somebody else to dig your trench and it might be a bit cheaper.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Dig your trench and put your cable in. Yeah.
Put your cable in it. So yes.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry if we went a little bit too detailed, but the idea is that the breakout groups, you can ask some questions and we can clarify any bits that didn't quite hit the spot in that first session. But I am told now that Menti is working. So if I could try, oh yes, I can see there's a line there. So I'm really hoping this is going to work again. So if I could ask you to go back in, put in the code and tell us your views on how well you understand the connections process. So I love this interactive feedback. We can see that people are not too bad. They've got a sense that they know some things. And some people know a lot. Votes have we got so far? 19. But there's definitely a lump, I'm thinking, at the earlier end of the scale. So that's really useful to know. If there's anyone that hasn't voted yet, I will give you 2 more seconds to do so. Lovely, thank you. That's really, really, really helpful. So we're going to move now into the breakout sessions. So this is the area where we really want to understand your existing knowledge. If there's anything that Ian or Matthew or I have said that you wanted clarifications on, there's no stupid questions in these. We really want to help you understand the processes and how to get connected as easily and cheaply as possible. So we've got 3 breakout sessions, I think, and we will automatically assign you to one. There will be a regen person, either George, Prina or myself, to facilitate that discussion. And you will have Northern Powergrid representative in there as well to demystify more of the connections processes. And we've got some questions that we'd love you to sort of start addressing. So things about your existing knowledge and hopefully share some examples and some experiences with others in the group. So I'm going to stop there and let George-Emma assign us to our groups. Hopefully. And if you don't want to wait for the click down, you can just click join room.
Oh. Where are we?
Okay, thanks everyone. We let that carry on a little bit longer because we started a little bit late, which means we're a bit behind on our Q&A. So I'm just going to go quickly into a group session. I was particularly going to ask the Northern Powergrid reps in the breakout groups if there was anything that they felt would be really useful at this stage to share with the wider group. So we had Ian in our session. Ian, was there a particular issue?
I don't think there was a particular theme that I mean, I think people had a variety of different places they were going. There's definitely we need, and this is something that we need to do, is to make sure that the information which is on our website is actually on our website in a way, in a manner that people can actually find it. Because the fact that I know it's on there is no use to somebody who hopes it's on there, doesn't know it's on there, and is trying to look for it. There's something for us to kind of up our game on that website and make some of the information more readily available, whether that's on costs for bits and bats, or I'll come on later to some of the discussion around information before you connect as to how likely your connection is going to be an easy one or a difficult one. I think the other thing that was in my mind was there was well, 2 other things actually. One is, again, information from us. We need to present the information in a way that's easy for people to understand. And when we're presenting letters to people that you need 30 years of experience in the electricity industry to understand, that's not helpful to those people because not everybody has that, and it's unfair to expect it of people. So we need to sort ourselves out on that. The final one is there is a little bit around kind of, as storage is becoming more cost effective and more common, there's definitely something around, look, when can you keep everything behind the meter? When can you even not have a cable in the first place and just look after yourself as and you know, lighting, solar lighting that has its own battery supply might be an option for some people. Definitely, if you have significant amounts of solar on your roof, consider whether storing that or using it in your house. Use it to charge your EV, whatever it might be. Is that a better bet than chucking it out onto the system? We're pretty agnostic on that, because like I said, we don't buy it or sell it. We just transport it. So if you want to use it behind your meter, we probably think that's a good thing. So
use as much of the renewables as you make. Thanks, Ian. We have, was it Matthew in the other breakout groups? I think we have Matthew and Cameron.
Hi there, yeah,
Matthew.
Yeah, so quite a wide range of things discussed in our breakout group, all from small connections up to microgrids and taking sections of the network off grid, which is quite a new thing. We haven't really had that before in large scale. So it's kind of getting the information that we need in order to put plans together to enable that. It's quite a simple thing to do from a Northern Powergrid standpoint, to take a community off grid or to provide private wire to that route. It's just one customer for us, but the complicated part is to arrange all the framework of how that energy group operates.
Lovely. Thanks, Matthew. And was it Cameron on the third group, George?
Yes, I believe so. Is Cameron there?
Cameron?
Hello. Yeah, I think in terms of our group, it was understanding people's individual experiences and the projects that they've got going on as well. From my point of view, it was from a contact center perspective, we don't necessarily see too many of these types of projects come through to us. So it was, for me, it was a great insight into the queries that people have and the questions they might have moving forward as well, to expand our own knowledge as well from a contact center point of view.
Lovely. Thank you. So we've actually, is there anybody that wanted to ask a question at this stage? Put a hand up. We are about scheduling time for our 10-minute break now. Helen.
I was just going to frame, I think, apologies because I had some technological issues during the course of that, but I think there's it would be useful if we have in the latter stages, there seems to be a lot of innovation as well as small scale community projects. There was a lot of discussion about as has been raised around innovation in this space, and so it might be something that we want to take at a separate session, to talk about some of those areas. There were some kind of key questions, I think, from Ian's perspective around microgrids and the use of microgrids, and again, that might be something we want to just reference, today. And also we had Liz from a Rural Design Agency and the work they're doing in Northumberland around the Community Energy Cooperative. So I was going to say, Poppy, if there's an opportunity, if Liz wouldn't mind just spending a few minutes during the course of the morning just to share that work more widely. I happen to know quite a lot about it. I just thought that would be really useful because it's an interesting model, which would be, would be beneficial for others just to hear very briefly. And also lots of expertise in Northumberland around community energy and enabling it at a community level.
Is that worth quickly covering now before we go to break?
Sorry, Liz, sorry to put you on the spot. It's just I know the value that project is doing and also what you're trying to do more strategically. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I feel like I should apologise. I had a meeting that ran till past this morning, so I actually missed the first bit of this session. So apologies for that, but hopefully I'll catch up. The lead on this project is Community Action Northumberland, who obviously have been working across Northumberland for sort of 50 years, bringing communities together. They have a very strong network within the village halls, who are obviously an essential part of life in especially in the rural areas. A very strong network in Northumberland. The village halls approached us and said that they were underutilised mainly because the buildings were cold and sort of falling into disrepair and people therefore didn't use them. They were expensive to heat, and obviously all of them were looking towards moving towards net zero and sort of cutting carbon. So we gathered together a group of them, originally 20 village halls and parish churches, community owned and run buildings, and looks at what we could do to sort of make the buildings more usable. We then got hit by Storm Arwen, and the lights went off and the power went off for up to 10 days in some of these sort of smaller villages, and obviously that caused quite a lot of concern for the villagers. And the village hall had the opportunity to become an emergency hub, so resilience became very important as well as energy saving and cost cutting. So we have been successful in getting several rounds of funding to complete feasibility studies into putting PV and battery storage into initially 20 village halls and community buildings. We've now got a list of about 50 or so who are keen to be involved in the project. We are working through things like the planning applications at the moment, the financial model, and we're also setting up a community benefit cooperative to manage all of the legal agreements and the financial transactions, obviously with the intention being to generate financial return for the community buildings that are directly involved, as well as moving towards net zero. So that's a real whistle-stop overview. I have to say I'm definitely not the expert on this, and especially on the the connection side of things, which is why we're obviously on this call today to try and learn a little bit more. We're at the stage at the moment where we've got funding for the first 3 schemes in terms of PV and batteries. We've got the planning application through for 2 out of 3 of those, and we've got a bit more work on the 3rd application, and we're continuing to do the feasibility studies on the rest of the buildings on the shortlist at the moment. I'll pop my email address in the chat. I'd be really happy to talk to anyone else with a bit more detail, and sort of put you in touch with the team at CAN as well, Community Action Northumberland, who are doing a lot of good work on it. But yeah, I'm keen to learn more. I need to up my understanding of grid connections. It's the next stage.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Liz. That's really interesting, and hopefully also the bit after the tea break will give a little bit more detail on some of that. So I'm going to break now for the tea break. We'll come back in 10, well, I'm going to say 9 minutes just to cut it a little bit, but I'm sure that's enough for a cup of tea. So I will see you at 11:19. Oh, sorry, 11:18.
Ian, in one of the areas that was covered, just for reference, was vehicle to grid, and there was some questions with regard to that in one of the breakout sessions that I was in. It was just to flag it as it might be something that to cover a little bit later on, and the whole piece about EV charging a vehicle to grid.
Yeah, I mean, vehicle to grid, I think to do it justice, we don't really have enough time this year. It's a huge topic area. We can certainly talk about it very briefly, but
yeah, I think we'll put it in because we've got a really big long list, because great topics raised, especially innovative ideas around from a number of people.
And we just I was having a quick flick through the chat as well, and it's also been pointed out to me. G98 is not restricted to households, never really was restricted to households, and you can export it. The issue is it mirrors effectively the 16 amps per phase, which is in the ESQCR or Electricity Act. I need to go away and check, sometimes I can't remember these things. But that in turn comes from the European directive previously. Now, on the assumption that they're not burning all the European stuff, then that 16 amps per phase and the derogation for small generation will still exist. But of course, if Jacob Rees-Mogg has his way, that might not be the case, but I don't think that's going to happen. And the other thing is it's based, or if I recall correctly, and I need to go and check again, I think it's based around installed capacity, not around export capacity. There's other things around short-term parallel and things like that in there where it all starts to get complex. But I think, yeah,
more complex.
Well,
So I think we are back. Sorry, I missed some of that, Helen, but we're sort of talking about this sort of some of the innovations coming up in your breakout group, and I think that's a really interesting area, like we mentioned. So with any luck, we can maybe talk a little bit more about that in the next breakout groups, and we will be keeping a sort of note of that for future sessions as well. So I think we are going to go, we've got a lot to cover and a lot of detailed stuff, and I'm everyone is under instructions to not go into too many acronyms and things, but we're aware that this is a complicated process, and so it is useful to take you through the different elements of it, things like timetables, application forms, changes that have been coming in this year about what different types of connections are liable to pay, etc. So we're going to do our best to, or actually Northern Powergrid are going to do their best to explain some of the detailed stuff, and then we'll have another breakout group where hopefully you can ask additional questions, or you can carry on the discussion before. So I'm going to ask George to put the slides up, and I think we go straight to Helen.
Yeah. So in our breakout room, you are all so different, and you've got very different starting points and loads of ambition, whether it's in a church context right through to taking a community off grid. So this is a big piece, and lots of those need an initial discussion. And so I guess the first message before I go into the detail of that, I guess the how-to guide for connections is about talking. We do have connection surgeries, which can be booked via the website, which is an opportunity to sit down with someone like Matthew and talk your idea through, to get a feel for the approach before you embark upon it. And that's pretty fundamental. They are incredibly busy. And one of the things I was going to add was, which comes up in a slide a bit later on, and a number of you already know about this, is that we are bringing on board a community energy advisory team, which will be working out in the regions to support groups like yourself. They're not in place as yet. That is something that's going to be happening across the next year or so. And when they're in play, that will obviously provide an additional level of support. We also have people like Connor and Lizzie on who are working, as they've described, at a local authority level strategically. But again, there's a great knowledge base to draw on in terms of questions. But I suppose first and foremost, it's about booking on a surgery to talk about your project, and looking at the resources that we have. We're going to talk about some of those. So some of this, the information is there to self-serve, and that is going to get better. I've tried to self-serve. I'm no expert in connections. I've never, I'm very generalist in energy, and it's not easy to navigate necessarily. So your feedback again on what tools and support would be useful to you is really, really helpful. But there is information on there to guide you through the process, and that is going to get better. Some of that Ian and our other colleagues are going to walk through. But again, you've met Cameron, who's from the contact centre, and they are incredibly diligent at finding answers for you. So that's a really good starting point as well. Recognising there's a lot of dispersed knowledge out there in Northern Powergrid, but you've met some of us today. You'll have our contact details, and that's sort of kind of the first point of call. Thanks, Poppy. So I think this is Matthew and Cameron, isn't it? Walking through the process, for real, step by step, just to give you a sense of what it's like. Cameron, thanks.
So I think that step one on there is completing an application. So with a lot of the time, certainly if we were to talk about your solar queries or your EV charging points, a lot of the application forms come in from installation companies on behalf of people who they're representing, rather than the actual owners of the buildings or properties themselves. So what we tend to find is that if you were to come to us with the queries that you have, you may have already spoken to an installation company, or you may ask the installation company to complete the form on your behalf. Forms, there's a few different ways of sending the application forms into us. So you'll have the option of, as I mentioned on there, with help from the team. So a member of the contact centre team will be able to run through an application form with you over the phone if required. You also have the option of taking the application forms away, so you can download them from the website. If you're then going to speak to your nominated installer about any queries that you have, take the form to them, run through the application form in your own time, and then as and when you're ready to return it to us, there'll be an email or a postal address to send it back to from there. In between the completing the application and the site visit step on there, what will happen is when your application comes in, it will be assessed by the team who set the applications up at our side, our setup team. So they will look at the information that has been provided and just to run through it, see if there's anything else that we need from you before it's moved on to Matthew's team to look into. And they would send out a request for information if that was the case. If not, then what would happen is there'll be a letter or an email that will go to you confirming that we have all the information that we need to move it on to the next step. And then from there, it would be the next contact you would have from that point would be from Matthew or someone within that remit, the team who look into the assessments themselves.
Great. Yeah, so I'll just take over from there, Cameron. So the team I work for will receive your application, have a quick look through to see exactly what you need. Some parts of this application are quite technical, so we may ask for further information, whether that's on loads or perhaps a substation location if we think it needs a substation. So we go back to yourselves, ask for that. And once we've received all the information that we need to produce a quotation, we'll start carrying out network studies to see whether whatever you're trying to connect will connect onto the network. And if it doesn't connect, if it doesn't work, what we need to do in order to make it work. So that's quite a lengthy process. And then from that, we can provide you a detailed cost to connect to the network. So we'll issue you a connection offer. Now, all of our connections are, well, the majority of them are regulated under EGS standards. So they have a set time frame where we have to get a quotation out to yourselves. And so this can be up to 65 working days, which may seem quite a lot of time, but the in-depth process of designing a scheme often requires that much time. So once you've received a connection offer, if you're happy with the offer, it goes through to acceptance, where the project engineer will contact yourselves and arrange a date to start works. And then works will begin and you receive a final connection at the end of it.
I think one thing to take from that as well is that at least each of these stages, you will have a single point of contact to speak to. It's not like you'll be coming back through to the contact center and potentially speaking to a different person every single time. At each step, there would be a specific point of contact for you as the customer to have, whether it's in the design stage or delivery stage. There will always be someone to speak to about the application you've submitted.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the other thing, Matthew, that probably is worth mentioning is that, and this is, I'm particularly thinking about community schemes that are looking towards decarbonisation and things like that. One of the things that we might well be coming back to discuss is how the demand loads you've got and the generation loads you've got, if you have both, and you may well, how they interact and actually reduce the take on our system as well, whether you're pushing energy out onto our system or taking it off our system. Because obviously we could sit there and say, well, if you've got 10 kilowatts of demand and you've got 10 kilowatts of generation, that might actually be, if they're nicely timed so that you're using it at the same time the sun's up, it might actually be very little that you're actually taking off or putting onto our system on any given day. You might want it though at other times in the winter, or you might have particular evenings when you're actually open after the sun has gone down. So we might be asking that sort of question rather than the kind of blank numbers up front. Those are the kind of questions that I would expect we might need to come back to you with. Matthew?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And that's more so for larger connections. A domestic property where we put in, maybe it's a 7 kilowatt array on the roof and a 10 kilowatt hour battery. We kind of know the profile, the low profile there. So if we do need to ask those questions, we will ask those questions. But we'd like to make it as simple as possible if we can. And we, you know.
I was just wondering if anyone had any particular questions before we moved on from this slide. If you did, then do stick a hand up. Okay, no, that's good.
Great. Yeah. So just a quick overview of the support that's available before you submit an application, and perhaps what some of the options are in order to get an offer. May not be a formal offer, but some sort of idea of costing. So before submitting an application, folks are not on their own. There is a support net, whether that be connection surgeries. We also have network availability heat maps, so they're available on our website. So if you know I want to connect this amount of load here, you can give yourself a good idea of whether that will actually work before submitting an application. And now we have several different options, which all vary in cost depending on how formal of a quotation you'd like. So a budget estimate is where we will cost up the cost to connect. We won't carry out any network studies on this. We may have a quick glance to say if it's a load that we know is just not going to happen. We wouldn't just go ahead and design it from that. We would use a bit of intelligence, but generally we don't carry out any network studies there. And that just gives you an idea how much it would cost. They're quite accurate on a budget estimate on how close it is to connect from a formal offer. A feasibility study kind of builds on that, where we start to do technical studies, and that's a yes or a no answer. So customer might say, okay, we want to connect a solar farm here. Can we connect before a formal connection offer? We do the studies on that, and we say yes, or we say no, we're going to need to do significant reinforcement. Perhaps it's better to choose a different area. And then the final connection offer is a formal quotation where everyone knows what they want, they apply to us, and that we provide them a formal offer for connection, which is valid for 90 days. And then finally, the connection offer expenses. This is the fee that we charge for our connection services in order to produce designs and quotations. And they do vary depending on what you're after. So a budget estimate is significantly cheaper than a connection offer. And there is a guide to those expenses on our website.
Just on that, Matthew, one just to pull out and notice, auto design there. It's a budget, but it is free of charge. You can do it in your own time, as it were. Because effectively, auto design is self-design, and it will actually do an automated design. So it does actually have design studies behind it. It's not applicable to all load types. It only works for small demands at the moment. But where it is applicable, it's worth a look, and it will actually vary the costing depending on where you'd like to route the cable and things like that. So I think that's worth noting. I'll mention that again later on, maybe.
There was one quick question that sort of Mike was asking, and I think we're moving on to time scales, are we, Matthew? Anyway, but it was about the time it takes to get the offer and then to get that work completed versus sometimes the sort of community funding and the time scales that they're given to spend that funding. So yeah, I think are you moving on to the time scales for some of this, not just the process, but then there's kind of connections at the end? Yeah,
we can quickly discuss that. So a large generator typically takes us 65 working days to quote. That's if we've got all the information from day one, and we can get a quote out in 65 working days. Now, from acceptance to delivery, there's a huge range of time frame. It could be 3 months, it could be 2 years. It just depends on the particulars of each individual project, whether we need legal consent to cross land, whether we need to order bespoke plant. Each scheme is individual, so I can't really say, oh, okay, for that type of connection, it requires this amount of time to deliver. But what I can say is from the design process in the terms of getting a formal connection offer out, 65 working days for large generation connections.
I was going to add, if there were any particular questions, about projects that would be beneficial to have a follow-up conversation, just put your details in chat and we can follow up with you, because if there are specifics that it will be easier to talk about in more detail with people on the call, we can arrange that subsequently. Poppy, just because I'm aware that sometimes there's a lot of detail behind some of those questions.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, so we're just quickly going to touch on the G99 application form. So this is for generation larger than 16 amps or 3.68 kilowatts per phase. Basically, this is the form that you submit to us with your application in order to connect generation to the Northern Powergrid distribution system. Now, I just want to touch on this briefly. One thing I would say is it's quite a complicated and complex form. So if you don't have any electrical experience or knowledge, it's well worth getting an electrical engineer to fill out this form on your behalf. And what that means is it just means that we've got all the information from the start so that we can provide you with an accurate quotation from the get-go. A lot of problems we have is when, not wrongly, a homeowner decides to fill out a G99 application themselves and a lot of information is missing, and perhaps it's quite a confusing form to fill out, and it means that it takes longer on that design process to get a yes or a no or a connection offer answer.
Matthew,
so yeah,
sorry to interrupt. When you're talking about what would be an example of project where somebody would be filling this in compared to an application where it may not be as complex?
Sure. Okay. So for example, if you're building a new property and you just want a normal connection for a standard property with no generation, that's quite a simple form. I want a house here and in this location, and it's going to consume this much electricity. That's quite an easy thing to apply for as a perhaps a homeowner or someone with not a huge amount of electrical knowledge. Where it does get complicated is perhaps I want this property with a 7 kilowatt PV array. So we need to know things like what type of inverter that you're going to be using, whether it's going to have any energy storage attached to that, the potential serial numbers of inverters. That's where it gets a bit more complicated. And so this form, it goes from all the way from homeowner all the way up to huge solar farms. So it covers everything. So there's a huge amount of boxes to fill in, and perhaps a lot of them are not relevant to smaller generators. So it's well worth, getting an electrical engineer if to fill out that form for the smaller generation.
Just on that as well, just to put some perspective on it. My house that I'm actually sat in as we speak, with it having PV on the roof, it's actually a G99 connection because I wanted 7.3 kilowatts on my roof, not 3.68. But even without that, I've got both generation and storage, which would have pushed it into G99 as well. So it's not a reasonable assumption that every domestic premises is going to be G98. It's very easy to get into G99, and we try not to be too onerous on G99 for the smaller stuff, but it's still under that guidance rather than the G98 guidance.
Yeah. So I'm hearing G98 easy to fill out, G99 harder to fill out, and you're often in the G99 territory. Is that the right summary?
Yeah.
More commonly now, if you were to roll back a few years ago, everything would have fallen into G98 because storage didn't exist, and most people were not putting 7.3 kilowatts on the roof.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Can I ask a quick question, Poppy?
Yeah.
And that is, I think the G99, I've filled in a few of these for SSE in territory, where we were trying to give advance notice of the project, long before it was built out. But we didn't necessarily know the inverter details or the solar panel sizes. That would be determined by the contractor on the day. So it would be filled in by the contractor coming back in. But what we did was we let the DNO know that this is what we were intending, but we didn't know the exact modules that were going to be used or the exact inverters, because that was going to have to go through a procurement exercise, which hadn't happened yet.
Yeah. The problem with that is, Alistair, we're not too bothered about the panels that go on the roof. It's the inverter. So the ENA has a type test register of G99. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if the inverter that you've chosen isn't type test registered, we need to send a protection engineer out to confirm that the G99 protection operates as it should.
Yeah.
Which has there's a cost associated with that. So we couldn't provide a formal quotation without knowing the inverter details, you know. Because it might not be a quotation. It's a yes or a no. It's yes, please go ahead and connect it.
I think the other thing is, yeah. I mean, to be fair, around that, this is not an uncommon problem as we get to the bigger stuff. And indeed, if you think of the very big stuff, where the transmission guys are saying you can't connect this for 10 years, you ain't going to be able to get whichever wind turbine or solar power solar farm, you know, the large solar farms, you know what I mean. You ain't going to be able to get those in 5 or 10 years. It'll have moved on to a new model. So while we might not be able to give you the absolute dotted I's and crossed T's, we'll be able to give you an offer, provided it's within the parameters that we expect. And if it goes outside those, we're going to have to go and restudy it and check it still works and things like that. But generally speaking, those things, they've happened in the past, they'll happen in the future, and we catch them around the edges, don't we, Matthew? So it's
I mean, to be fair, I get your position totally, you know, and I think the specifications tend to go out, always ask for MCS. They must meet MCS requirements. So it means it's already in your checklist. So it should be a formality, really.
Yeah. It's probably actually more of a problem on the big stuff where what people can get as a wind turbine in 10 years' time, I have no idea.
Yeah.
We got a couple of questions, Helen, or clarification, Helen and Richard, but I'm aware we need to get into our breakout groups where we can maybe have some more of these detailed discussions.
Sure, Poppy. Mine was just because I learned this new word a little while ago, but the word inverter, what that means for those that are not necessarily technically involved in this, please.
Sure.
Thanks.
All that is, it's the bit of kit that takes the electricity produced from your solar panels, or in this case, as well as wind turbines, and pushes it out to the grid.
Yeah.
Richard.
Yeah, I just wanted to observe that so community energy projects really often have that situation that Alistair describes, where you've got to know a connection cost way in advance of knowing what you're going to get on the roof, or in if it's a turbine in the field or whatever. But so you have to know that well in advance. You have to make that connection application, get the quote. Typically, that will, and then you have to then build your sort of your financial model around that, incorporate that, raise community shares and so on. So but what I'm hearing here is basically you're saying, like, yeah, we understand that's what happens. You just have to sort of like get something in indicatively correct, and then we'll work with you. Is this right? Is this fair to say? And we'll work with you if it changes a bit, then it's okay, and we won't come back with another big new connection fee. Is that right?
Yeah, the world isn't perfect, and sometimes we need to be a bit iterative around things.
Yeah, and perhaps it's just understanding the conditions for that, what you need to put on your procurement when you do get your inverter or your solar panels, and making sure that is consistent with what NPG are expecting.
And the key phrase there is G99 type tested.
G99 type tested. So now we know what to put on our on our requests. I'm just going to move on.
Or G98 if that's the more appropriate standard.
G98. Matthew, is it you? We got another couple of slides before breakouts. Oh no, back to Ian.
I was just going to grab these. We can just want to go through some of the bits and pieces that will give you some indication before you talk to us formally. Things you can pick up off our website that might help. So if we flip on to the next slide, heat maps. Now heat maps. It gives you indication of how loaded our system is in terms of either demand or generation. There's one for each, and on the left you can see the kind of map-based pictorial version, which you can flick up. On the right is the data behind it, which is also available to you and you can download. Now I would always urge a little bit of caution with these things, because they don't tell you for a particular installation what the answer is. They tell you generically, is this a more difficult area or an easier area, really? Red does not mean you cannot connect something. Green does not mean you can connect anything. So it's something to read. It's information that's there, but it's, as with anything, you've always got to be able to interpret information. It's not as simple as just connect whatever you want. But it is there, and it does give information, give some background as to what's going on, and more importantly, if you start to if you look through why it's an issue, or you get your contractor or your installer to read, you'd expect that they have reasonable electrical knowledge to read through and understand why it is that there's an issue. Then that might be quite enlightening as to what can be done in that area. The other thing we mentioned earlier was auto design. There's some questions in the chat. Does auto design work for generation? No, it doesn't. Does it work for big loads? No, it doesn't. It works for low voltage loads. But you can stick something on there, and you'll get a good idea not only of whether it works, but what the cost is as well. Now, again, there are provisos and ifs, buts, and maybes about this. It doesn't always give you an answer. Sometimes it gives you a kind of, you're going to have to speak to us type answer. That is the nature of the system. In certain places it's like that. Other places it will give you a pretty decent answer, and it will be reasonably clear as to which that is. So again, that's available to you on our website. You can go and look at it. You don't need to wait for us to come back any longer than it takes you to click on a button and it comes back in kind of internet speeds. So those were the kind of two kind of tools I was just going to mention about there. You will also find a whole lot of other bits and pieces in terms of what's called the LC25 statement and things like that. They're probably too big for conversations about community energy. They're really more aimed at the kind of merchant generators and large demands, and the consultants who would deal with those kind of things. And they're also quite in depth. So that information is there, but I wouldn't necessarily be recommending that to this group in particular. I noticed a hand go up. I think it was one of our Mike Ks. We've got two Mike Ks out there today.
It was definitely a Mike. Yeah.
Yeah, it was about the heat maps and also the G99s. I mean, I've been in the renewable energy sector now for 25 years, and one of the frustrations I've got is we've known this situation was coming down the track for quite a long time. And with all the DNOs, it would be good if there was some sort of, for example, if projects were running in the southwest, anything over 100 kilowatts gets referred to the national grid, and immediately comes back and they say you can't have anything until 2037. You know, this everybody's known about this. I just find it frustrating that obviously you guys are doing a lot of good work, but it's just why is it taking so long?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Mike.
And let me just say, I have sympathy with that. It is unfortunately outside my control, because what you're talking about is another company's position. So I can't comment on what they may or may not have done. I do understand that. That said, we're taking the position. I've sent the memo around to all my staff on 1 megawatt and 1 megawatt export. So I would have thought the majority of community schemes that should be bringing you back into something that's back in our control. We're not talking to NGC about those schemes. Sorry, National Grid Company, NGESO, NGET. So
just to clarify that then.
Yep.
Any projects where we've got sort of 500 kilowatts of generation and 500 kilowatts of storage, so we've got a meg effectively. Yep. Anything like that in terms of a community project will not get referred to National Grid.
If you're let's make it. Can I make it 501?
Yeah, fine.
I would never actually hold you to this either, because I can't count. I can't count at this level, and the rounding error brings it back in. But let's call it 600 of each, okay?
Yeah.
Just to be clear, if both of those are going to output fully at the same time, then you've got 1,200 kilowatts going out, and we might have to refer that. I would still be looking to go, really, but because I don't believe it is the first thing. Solar rarely outputs fully, and if you've got battery and solar you're probably
You're never going to
use
discharge
solar.
both at the same
No,
time.
you wouldn't. You just wouldn't be doing that, and except in really unusual circumstances, like when ESO are actually asking everybody please to do that, in which case that's a different story anyway. So I would not expect that to be being referred. And if I find my guys referring it, or if you find my guys referring it, just make them chase it through to me, and I'll deal with that one. I mean,
that's really reassuring, and I think that's a really enlightened way to look at these projects. So I'm very reassured by that.
Yeah, we're looking at the net position, and the reason the thinking behind it was, look, if you had a company that was looking to reduce its energy use, and it did it by putting a load of PV on the roof. So let's say they take a 1500 kilowatts, 1.5 megawatts, and they put a load of PV on the roof and they drop it down. Okay, that's meant to be referred to NGC, and yet next door is an identical company, and they managed to do it by getting these super duper light bulbs and fridges that take no power and so on and so forth, and they do it by energy efficiency, and that doesn't get referred. And next down the road there's an identical company, and they shut up shop and stopped taking 1.5 megawatts off the system. Those, from the point of view of the network, they're identical. So why would we treat it differently?
Yeah. It's good to know, and we have to go to breakout soon. I mean, just on the sort of the bigger question on transmission, Mike, that is something we are hoping that will get solved. There are lots of discussions happening at the moment about how that date of 2037 could be brought forward. So we're sort of hopeful that some of that will be resolved at higher level. But it's really good to see Northern Powergrid helping you sort of negotiate that for the time being, because like you said, it's not directly. I'm just keen that we get to the next slide, Ian, and then get into the breakout groups.
Let's grab that last slide then. Look, we mentioned the costs breaking down in different ways. There's the kind of sole use costs, the assets that connect from your premises to our existing network, and those costs would fall to you. Once we get beyond that, there might be reinforcement costs as well. Reinforcement's driven both by the generic kind of or organic growth of people attaching new things to existing connections within that connection arrangement, or changes in when they use it, and so it coincides more. That is one driver. The other driver is a new connection to our system. Of the form of those two, it's generally actually fallen away over the last couple of decades, if I'm really honest. And it's any growth is people connecting new stuff. How the costs for that reinforcement lie come under a defined set of rules. Generally speaking, for demand, as of April 1st, generally speaking, there will be pretty much no charge. That's not an absolute statement, but it's pretty much a statement. As we get to generation, anything that's on the same voltage level as you, there is potentially a charge, but as you get to the higher voltage levels, that falls away as well. And then the charge gets split between the proportion you're using, the proportion of the new asset that you're using, these reinforced assets that you're using, and the proportion you're not. We pay for the proportion you're not, because effectively that's looking after an existing system. That's not new. It's just maintaining the existing position, and you guys would pay the increase, or the proportion that's the increase there for you. There are specific rules, and if I said that not quite exactly right, please don't crucify me, because some people know those rules absolutely backwards. That's generically what it is, but you need to actually read the specific rules. It is actually a little bit more in your favour than I've said there. Shall we go into the breakout group on the back of that?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Ian. So yeah, just to there's some changes from the 1st of April that could make, if your project had triggered constraints and work on the network in a demand respect, could make that cheaper, and on generation, there's a possibility it would be cheaper.
And the keyword to Google is access SCR. If you wish to know more about that.
Lovely. Okay, well, let's go into the Oh, Helen, I wonder if we should just do that slide actually at the
Just to recap.
After the breakout groups. So we'll give you some. We'll go back to Helen. She can give you some people to contact at the end. So yes, we will go. Emma and George or both will put us into breakout groups, and we will come back 10 to 15 minutes before the end. Okay, thanks everyone for those discussions. We got into some of the real detail there, so it was hopefully useful for everybody. I'm going to just put up the slide now for Helen, just to give some views on where you can go next in Northern Powergrid. George, can you stick that back up, or Helen, you could.
I can just talk, can't
Yeah,
I?
you can talk. Yeah.
So there's some really key messages today, to be honest. And Liz just raised in our breakout that actually she's probably learnt more from her breakout than anywhere else because of the sharing of knowledge and expertise. And is there an opportunity to set something informally to share knowledge? So what I was going to add was, we've talked a lot about, you know, the importance of having discussions, practical discussions in a kind of connection surgery about your project. We've also talked about the importance, I guess, of who you can talk to even before you get to that stage. And that might be Northern Powergrid, it might be actually somebody else in the community energy space. So we're going to give a real think about how we frame that and enable that. We also, in our group, actually, George raised the resources and the discussion forums that Community Energy England have, you know, as providing practitioner support around community energy. And so I just wanted to flag that. I think a really big message from today is that this requires significant hand-holding. And as an organisation with Northern Powergrid, some of you have had experience, some of it has been challenging, some of it has been time-consuming, and some of it has been very technical. And that's, to some extent, isn't going to change necessarily overnight. But I think, as you've heard, you know, from some of the conversations, we really want to help and enable you to undertake your projects and and within the timeframes that you're working to, which isn't necessarily always easy. But you've met a group of people today as a conduit to the organisation, so please get in touch. And there are resources on the website to enable you. But I think whether it's talking to Cameron in the contact centre, you know, as the first point of call for an application, as a route into the organisation, or with your sleeves rolled up, talking to the design team, or if you are in the local authority space, you know, we really need to put you in touch with Lizzie Connor and Derek Fairbairn and that team to talk about strategic planning. But I think the more that we can discuss it, the more we can work it through, and that you feel that you're being listened to and we're taking your views on board, you know, it's really important. We've also had a lot of feedback about the complexities of some of the application process and the importance of lobbying on your behalf at energy with the other energy, the other network organisations, to take that on, to consider how it's going to be really even more important to have resources and application forms that are accessible and that are relevant for low carbon technology. So we will take that on board. And finally, I just wanted to flag, and this isn't necessarily related to a community energy organisation, it's much broader, but Ian and I had the pleasure in the last year to work on a soft launch of the Northern Powergrid Foundation, which is funding around resilience that was put together following Storm Arwen. The Northern Powergrid Foundation, it will be is setting up over the next few months and will launch. And what that will provide is, it's an independent charity to Northern Powergrid, an independent foundation, and it will provide seed corn funding for resilience, low carbon technology, fuel poverty, community development projects across the region. When Ian and I worked on it, as almost a pilot a little while ago, we saw a lot of low carbon technology, very small scale projects coming from communities. And this funding was used for feasibility. It was used for actually setting projects up in communities on a very small scale. So I recognise that, you know, funding is a real challenge, and a number of you talked about the importance of CCOR funding, and this may be an additional source that will come on board in the next month or so when that launches. And we can provide information about when that happens. You do need to be a charity to access that funding. So that's not available to, I guess, public sector bodies or local authority bodies necessarily. Sorry, public sector bodies or commercial businesses necessarily. But for charities, it has been very useful, and we've done a lot of learning around some of the community projects that we supported. So I just wanted to flag that, because that was another theme that came out of today. Thanks, Poppy.
Lovely, thank you, Helen. And we'll be sending around the slides and some contact details, etc. as well. Talking of funding, George, I was wondering if we should just quickly mention something that Regen are going to be running for Northern Powergrid in the next couple of weeks, months as well.
Yeah, so in May, it should be May, we're going to be launching the Net Zero Community Energy Fund, which is a fund specifically for communities and community energy organisations working on energy projects, and the details are just being finalised. But keep your eyes peeled. Keep your eyes on the Northern Powergrid website, newsletter, as well as Regen's newsletter for more information. And we'll make sure that details are sent around to everyone that was signed up today.
Lovely, thanks, George. Yeah, and that's the second year of that fund, which is great. So you can see what was achieved last year as well. We're going to go back to Menti quickly, because we'd love to know whether we're really hoping we might get a higher score after today. But we do realise there's a lot more to be done, as Helen was saying, and we're hoping to keep improving things. But yes, we're hoping to see that you understand the connections process a little bit better after that session. So it'd be great if we could get a few more votes in and see if we've achieved our objectives. So it's looking positive, because it's definitely higher than the 2.4 we had at the beginning. So I will give you a few more seconds to complete that, but at the moment I'm feeling really pleased, and hopefully the Northern Powergrid team are too, that's definitely gone up the scale. So that's really good news. But yes, it is, I guess what we have tried to get over today, which is probably obvious, is that it's quite a complex area, and there's a lot to sort of understand about different projects and getting them connected, but that there is hopefully support, advice, and other communities that can help you along that journey. So thank you very much for your votes on that. We have a final Menti question, which is just about the session overall. Actually, sorry, there are two questions. We want to know how the session went today and how satisfied you were with the session. This is just something that we try and feed back to help us make sure that we are getting the right learning out to you, and we're running these effectively, and we're meeting our objectives for Northern Powergrid.
It looks like we might have the same issue that we had
no, it doesn't work.
earlier. Yeah.
Oh well, we got the second one working. We will send you around that afterwards. We'd also be really interested to hear, we had some ideas already today about the things that you would like to cover at future sessions. So we will, I don't think this one's going to work either, but we'll send that around with the slides and get some, it'd be good to get your thoughts on what else you would like to learn about. I think the innovation was a really interesting one. Helen said there was a number of discussions about innovative ways to get connected or to run your projects with the network, the sort of vehicle to grid, I heard as one of the options, the sort of microgrids and things like that. So we think there might well be a mileage in doing something where people have been looking at these more complex options. Oh, we have got answers. Fantastic. So yes, if you've got thoughts, then please let us know what those are. So community energy advisors. which we have mentioned today. We're really looking forward to having those in place. Connections timeline update, yes, so the National Grid ESO. So we sort of touched on that in some of the discussions about some of the constraints that everyone is facing at transmission. I think that's sort of the note from Ian that anything under a megawatt might be able to get under that barrier would hopefully be useful to some of you. But yeah, there are some bigger projects that doesn't necessarily help. Microgrids, that's good to see that coming up. And then, yeah, embedded generation, complex sites, and how that sort of, how generation and demand are working together on particular sites and the impact of that on the network.
I think probably just on the microgrids one, I think microgrids mean very many different things to very many different people. If what people mean are private wire networks, that's a very, very specific sort of microgrid. There are other microgrids out there. Some are commercial balancing commercial balancing based. Some are technical resilience based, and some of them effectively look like commercial premises, factories have had for years, and they don't look very different to that. So it means different things to different people. I think peer-to-peer trading is a very interesting one. I would love to be able to talk about peer-to-peer trading. I think we might need to push the regulation in the right direction, because I think that is the issue around that at the moment. Private wire got mentioned by somebody on one of our breakout groups. That can certainly be discussed in the sense of it exists. We're probably exactly the wrong people to lead on that, though, for obvious reasons.
Yeah. George.
It's just to say that I think the previous question has been sorted. So if we can go back to that at the end, Poppy. Okay.
Fantastic. Yeah, that would be great. But let's move on to that now. I know we've only got a few more minutes left, so I just wanted to say thank you so much to all of you for coming along today. I hope that it has answered some of your questions, or at least let you know where you can find answers to some of your questions. It was really nice to see that score has changed a bit today from what you've learned. And also thanks very much to the Northern Powergrid reps. Helen, Ian, Matthew, Cameron, Connor and Lizzie, I think I've got everyone's names, for being on the call and helping people out. But also, certainly in our group, it was really great to get advice from other community energy groups to other community groups, like Helen was saying, that sort of that networking has really helped people resolve issues or really understand how others have dealt with the similar issues. So we will look to take that forward in some way and try and find ways that networking can happen, because we're aware that almost at its heart is how community groups are being sort of organically learning and connecting projects and coming up with great ideas. So we're really keen to see more of that going forward, which is part of what we're hoping to achieve today. So thank you so much everyone for coming and for voting. We've finally got the Menti working at the end of the session, so that's great. And thank you for the Regen team for running it. Goodbye.
Cheers, folks.